This is Palm Sunday. A very busy week in the life of Jesus and his disciples. A very busy week for those of us who are believers in Jesus. Chris and I recently took up archery. We have compound bows. We're experts now. We've been doing it about 3 weeks. Went on our first shoot recently, and it reminds me a lot of golf. There are 18 different stations. I keep wanting to call them holes because I'm a golfer. But you go to these 18 different stations, and there's targets that you shoot at, and the different, they're 3D targets, so they look like animals and stuff. And so different distances, and you shoot. And archery, I've discovered, is very similar to golf, and they both really match life. Because you can go to one hole or one target, and you can get a perfect score. You can par the hole, or you can get a 12 on the target. That's the best. Hit the bullseye. But then you go to the next hole or the next target, and you miss the target, or you double bogey the hole. And it's just like life. You have these good days and you have these bad days. And I was thinking about that in relation to Palm Sunday and Holy Week and all that the disciples went through during this week, the ups and downs of this week in the lives of the disciples. I'd like to take a look at, we're going to be in the Gospel of Matthew, no, we're not, the Gospel of Mark. I told you, it's one of those days. I'm on kind of a down slope right now. If you look in your bulletin, the right gospel is there, whatever it says, Mark, right? But it says the wrong chapter because I gave Chris the wrong chapter. We're actually going to be in Mark chapter 15 today, not chapter 14. My apologies on that. It's just kind of the way this week has gone. But before we get to chapter 15, we're going to start off in Mark chapter 11, and we're going to talk about, Palm Sunday, what kind of why we call this Palm Sunday. So turn to Mark chapter 11, verses 7 through 10. Mark 11, verses 7 through 10. And they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." I read that and I was thinking about the disciples, and this must have been the highlight of their life. When they heard the crowd's reaction to Jesus entering Jerusalem on that Palm Sunday, they must have thought, this is it. This is what we've been waiting for. Jesus is going to establish his kingdom, and we are right in the middle of it. It was a 12-day or a birdie day if you're a golfer, right? It was the best day. Maybe a hole-in-one day. It was the best day of their life. Little did they know that just a few short days later, it would be the worst day of their life. I think we can relate to that because we have those, don't we? We have our great days, and then we have some horrible days. It's just a part of life. Today we're going to take a look at the path to the cross, Jesus' path to the cross and what he went through. And we are going to be in Mark chapter 15. And kind of left the notes blank for you to kind of pick and choose what you'd like to follow along and note in this series. Because this is, not this series, in this lesson today, because this is something, it's we hear it every year, right? Palm Sunday, Easter, there's not a lot of different ways to tell the story. So I'll leave it up to you what you find noteworthy this morning. But we are going to pick up after Jesus has already had the Last Supper. He's already gone out to the garden and prayed. He's already been arrested. And now the Jewish leaders have handed him over to Pilate. So we're going to focus on this time frame from that point on. So turn to Mark chapter 15, and we'll start off looking at verses 6 through 15. Mark 15, verses 6 through 15. Now at the feast, he used to release for them one prisoner for whom they asked. And among the rebels in prison who had committed murder in the insurrection, there was a man called Barabbas. And the crowd came up and began to ask Pilate to do as he usually did for them. And he answered them, saying, "Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews?" For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priests had delivered him up. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And Pilate again said to them, "Then what shall I do with the man you call the king of the Jews?" And they cried out again, "Crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Crucify him." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. You know, it's odd when we look at this crowd's reaction. We see just a few days earlier a crowd welcoming Jesus into the city, laying cloaks and palm branches and tree branches on the ground, Hosanna, wanting to crown him king. But then a few days later, there's a crowd crying out, "Crucify him." And we kind of look at this situation and we think how fickle those people were. But the more I look at it, I don't think this was the same crowd. Because when you think about the people who met Jesus and greeted him, they were followers of Jesus. They were ready for the kingdom to be established, if you will. But now think about when Jesus was arrested. He was arrested at the dark of night because the Jewish leaders did not want to, cause a riot. They didn't want the crowd to come to Jesus' defense. So they arrested him in the dark of night. The only ones of Jesus' followers who knew that Jesus was arrested really were the disciples. And who would have thought that the Jewish leaders would have broken their own law by rushing the trial so quickly? So there was really no time for true Jesus followers to come to his defense. On the other hand, there was this man Barabbas who was in prison for murder, for being part of the insurrection. And his followers, his supporters, they knew they only had one chance to ever get Barabbas out of prison. And that was to take advantage of the Romans' custom to release one of their prisoners at the Passover. So they were there. They were ready. They wanted to lobby to have Barabbas released. It was like a presidential pardon. This was their only chance. So they were there to get Barabbas out of prison. So it was only natural for the Jewish leaders who hated Jesus to encourage the Barabbas followers to call out for Barabbas. Don't ask for Jesus to be released. So I don't think this is a case of the fickleness of the Jews as we sometimes attribute to this account. I really think it's two different groups. And it's a case of the wrong people being in the right place at the right time to get Barabbas released instead of Jesus. As we look now at the crowd's behavior here, I see three things that they did, three choices that they made that really we are still making similar choices today in our society. This crowd is there. And first thing they did is they chose lawlessness over law. Right? They have a choice. They could pick Barabbas, get him freed, or they could have Jesus freed. They chose Barabbas. Barabbas represents lawlessness. Right? He was a murderer. He was arrested. But Jesus came to fulfill the law. He was innocent. But they chose lawlessness. In our own society, don't we see that in our society? Just people in general, I think, we aren't real fond of laws, are we? We don't like people telling us what to do. We don't like to have laws. And sometimes people push the border, push the boundary of the law, or there are those who are just outright lawbreakers, right? They don't care about law. They're going to do their own thing. They're going to break the law. We all have that choice. There are laws. Laws exist. We can follow them. We can push the limits, or we can just outright break them. We have that choice. We have to make that choice every day. And usually people in society don't care too much for those who enforce the laws, because we don't want people telling us what to do. We don't like seeing those lights in our rearview mirror when we're driving maybe a little bit too fast. It's never our fault, right? Well, why would you give me a ticket? We don't like that. So, that sometimes law enforcement isn't thought very highly of in a society, and that's wrong. We should support those who enforce the laws, but that's just kind of human nature. So we have to make a choice. Are we going to be lawbreakers, or are we going to be law followers? The second choice they made is they made a choice over war over peace. They chose war over peace. You look at Barabbas again. They chose a man of blood, a man who was accused of murder during the insurrection. He was part of a group. Yeah, you can take my word on that. I don't know. I can't find out what they're called. It was a word that I practiced, and I don't even see it in my notes. They had daggers. They were called the dagger men or something like that. Anyway, because they were always ready to pounce. They were ready. They hated the Romans. They were ready to go to war against Romans. They had daggers hidden on their person, and whenever they had a chance to kill a Roman, they would strike. They wanted to go to war with Rome. So they chose a man of war, where Jesus was the Prince of Peace. He came to bring a peace treaty between us and God. And we have that same choice in our society. We can choose to be peaceful, or we can choose to be at war. We can choose people of war. And the third choice they made is they chose hate over love. They chose hate over love. Again, Barabbas was a man of hate. He hated the Romans and anything to do with Rome. But Jesus is love. He came to lay down his life for us because he loves us. We have that choice. We can hate or we can love. I think our society, is getting more and more hateful the further along we get. And I attribute a big part of that to what I call unsocial media. It's supposed to be social media, but you look at it now, it's unsocial. It is nothing sociable about unsocial media at all. It started off as a way of connecting people, and like all things, it started off with good intentions, and then people use it for evil purposes. But you look at social media today, and people are so hateful. And they will say things to people online that before on social media, we would never dream of saying something like that to a person in person. It was just not acceptable in a normal society. But it has become normalized, so much so now that it's not just on social media now. Now it is in our face. Now people are just hateful to one another out in public, not behind the safety of their computer. So we have to make a choice. Are we going to be people of hate, or are we going to be people of love? All right, enough on that one. Let's move on to verses 16 through 20. Mark 15, verses 16 through 20. And the soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is, the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. And they clothed him in a purple cloak, twisting together a crown of thorns. They put it on him, and they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. So Jesus had already been scourged before being handed over to the soldiers. And then he was subjected to all this ridicule and mocking. And this was a normal part of what the Roman soldiers did before they crucified somebody. They would humiliate them. They would mistreat them. They would beat them. And in Jesus' case, they personalized the treatment based on the crime to which he was accused. Since he was accused of being the king of the Jews, they thought they would mock him for being a king. And they put him in a kingly purple robe, and they mockingly bowed down, and they put a crown of thorns on his head. They just humiliated him and beat him. And Jesus had to go through that. And really, ever since this time, Christians throughout our history have been subjected to persecution and ridicule simply because we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Just because we are Christians. And we haven't had to face that a whole lot yet in our country. We have had some, and I believe it's going to get worse. But you look at other Christians around the world, and they have been persecuted simply for the fact that they're Christians. They've been martyred. They've died for the cause of Christ, for the name of Christ. And it all started here, when Jesus himself was mocked and ridiculed and martyred. He was killed for us. Continuing verses 21 through 32. Mark 15, 21 through 32. And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charges against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Ah, you who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. There's a lot going on in this passage, from Jesus enduring more mocking, him suffering in agony, carrying his cross to Golgotha. Something I want to focus on, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all mention that the Romans forced someone named Simon to carry Jesus' cross part of the way, that final way to Golgotha. Jesus had already carried the cross through the town. That's kind of another way the Romans did crucifixions. They humiliated you every way they could, and then they paraded you through town. They made you carry your own cross, and they paraded you through town because they wanted this to be a deterrent to others who may have ideas of turning against Rome and doing things that these people being crucified had done. So Jesus had wandered through the town with the cross. They get out of the gates, heading up to Golgotha, and he can't do it anymore. He had been so badly beaten that he collapsed. And so the Romans grabbed Simon and said, "You carry it the rest of the way." Now it's interesting that Mark is the only one who mentions, they all mention Simon, but Mark adds that he was the father of Alexander and Rufus. And you might ask me, well, why would Mark add that extra little bit of detail that means nothing to us, right? We don't know who Alexander and Rufus are any more than we know who Simon is. But it must have meant something to the original audience that Mark was writing to. And Mark was writing to the church in Rome. So he was writing to Roman Christians. So it's assumed that the Roman church would have known who these people are. And that Paul's letter to the Romans actually gives us a little bit of insight to that and kind of corroborates that. If you look at Romans 16, verse 13, Paul writes, "Greet Rufus, chosen in the Lord, also his mother, who has been a mother to me as well." So Paul knows who Rufus is, and his mother, which would be Simon's wife. So they were, after this event of Simon carrying the cross, they became active in the church, the early church. They supported Paul in his ministry. In fact, in Acts chapter 13, where Paul kind of lists a group of people in Antioch who were helpful to him, Acts 13 at verse 1 says, "Now there were in the church at Antioch prophets and teachers, Barnabas, Simeon, who is called Niger." Well, Simeon is another form of Simon. Niger is a Latin word which means black or dark, and it was used to denote someone from Africa with dark skin. And Mark said that Simon was from Africa. So Simon's experience carrying the cross, now whether he was already a follower of Jesus or if he was a convert to Judaism who had come to celebrate Passover, but whatever his circumstance was before the crucifixion, something changed. Either strengthened his faith in Jesus or made him a believer in Jesus, because he became a supporter of Paul and Barnabas' missionary journeys to the Gentiles. So this man that carried the cross had a big impact afterwards. It wasn't just an isolated event. Now, something else that I'd like to mention, from time to time I'll share with you some things that non-Christians try to use against us to disprove the Bible or to weaken our faith. And this is, there's something surrounding this Simon carrying the cross that can appear to be contradictory. We believe that the Bible is without error in its original writings, right? It is perfect. There's no contradictions. There's no errors in Scripture. Well, when you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke's account of the crucifixion here, they all three mention that Simon was made to carry Jesus' cross at the end, the last stretch up to Golgotha. Well, in John chapter 19, verses 16 and 17, John writes, "So he, Pilate, delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and he went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha." So there appears to be a little bit of a conflict there. Well, John says that Jesus bore his cross to Golgotha. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke say that part of the way, at least, Simon carried the cross. So who's right? Well, both of them can be right. Because as I said, the Romans made the crucifixion victims parade through the town. So from John's perspective, Jesus carried his cross all the way through the town up to the town gates. And he didn't necessarily say carried, he said bore his cross. So Jesus did bear his cross to Golgotha. He was crucified, just like he bore our sins on that cross. But from John's perspective, he saw Jesus bear his cross out through the gates. And then Matthew, Mark, and Luke are also correct, because outside the gates, that last trail up to Golgotha, Jesus fell, was unable to continue carrying it, so the Romans made Simon carry it. There's not really a conflict there. There's no error It's just a matter of two different perspectives on what constitutes bearing one's cross to Calvary, to Golgotha. So if anybody brings that up against you, you'll have some kind of response for them. That's not a flaw, not a conflict at all. All right, let's continue back in Mark 15:33 through 41. Mark 15:33 through 41. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, behold, he is calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was the Son of God. There were also women looking on from a distance, among whom were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the younger, and Joseph, and Salome. When he was in Galilee, they followed him and ministered to him. And there were also many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. In this passage, again, there's a lot going on here. I just want to focus on one part of this passage. This is when he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, if we take just that line in the context of the crucifixion, I think we've all been kind of taught that that's the moment when our sin was placed upon Jesus. Jesus, the sinless one, was experiencing sin and the separation that it gives us from God at that very moment. And he cried out, God, why have you left me? Why have you forsaken me? That's if you take it in that little narrow context. But in the bigger picture, Jesus is quoting the first line of Psalm 22. And I'm going to kind of give that to you as homework. If you would look at Psalm 22 and read that over, it's a psalm of David, but it really talks about the purpose or the result, the end result of the crucifixion for us. Because in this psalm, David is lamenting all of the bad things that happened to him in his life. And it starts off, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he lists a bunch of things and why he feels forsaken by God. But then after each of those negatives, there's another paragraph that starts, yet you have done all these things. And it shows the balance or the contradiction or the opposite of these bad things happen, yet God was there and he did these things to get me through. And it just kind of goes back and forth. These bad things, yet God did this. These bad things, yet God did that. And it really, if you read it as if Jesus is reading it from the cross, it is really powerful. And I see it as a way of Jesus telling his Jewish audience there, hey, look at Psalm 22. You know the scriptures. Look at this. This isn't the end. Let me read as Psalm 22 kind of comes to a conclusion near the end of the passage, verses 27 and 28. Psalm 22, verses 27 and 28 says, all the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. For kingship belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. So while that line may have been uttered from the cross because that was the moment our sins were placed on Jesus, if you want to think of it that way, I think he is also letting them know, hey, this is not the end. Don't forget the yet. There is yet more to be done. And that's what we celebrate next Sunday, is the yet. Right now, things look very bleak. Imagine how the disciples felt at this moment. Just a few days prior, they thought, woohoo, Jesus is going to start his kingdom and we're going to be part of it. And now they stand there and they see Jesus die on the cross. But he calls out, look at Psalm 22. This isn't the end. There's a yet to happen. Finishing up in Mark 15, 42 through 47. And when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself looking for the kingdom of God, took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate was surprised to hear that he should have already died. And summoning a centurion, he asked him whether he was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the corpse to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb that had been cut out of the rock. And he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. So Jesus was dead. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin and a secret believer in Jesus, went and asked for Jesus' body. He got the body, and Joseph, in other Gospels we see Joseph and Nicodemus, wrapped Jesus up and placed him in the tomb. And there were some women watching, seeing where they had laid the tomb. And they saw that, it was kind of hastily done, and they wanted to give Jesus a proper burial. So they're making plans on how they can go back and fix that. You know how, ladies, you can relate, right? You always have to fix something that the guys did. Right? The guys were in a rush. They just kind of wrapped him up and put him in the tomb. So the ladies had to go fix the job, do the job right. And these ladies were Mary Magdalene, and it says Mary, mother of Joseph. Well, Joseph was Jesus' brother. So the Mary there is Mary, the mother of Jesus. So Mary Magdalene and the mother of Jesus were making plans to do a proper burial for Jesus. So this is the low point. After that triumphal entry, after all the hosannas, after crown him, make him king, and the disciples are just riding high, the highest, best day of their life, and then the rug is pulled out from under them. Now they are at their low point. Have you ever been there? Have you had the highest of highs followed by the lowest of lows, and you're just devastated? You don't know what to do. Well, learn from this situation. Jesus says, we're not done yet. Don't give up when you're at the bottom, because there's a yet to happen. We know what comes next. We'll talk about that next week. But it's not over. The message for us is when things look bleak and we think we're at the end of our rope, we need to hold on, because that's the exact time that God really steps up. That's when we see God at work most in our life, is when we can't do anything on our own anymore. We are just at rock bottom. Now he says, get out of the way and watch me. There's a yet to be had. God has a way, doesn't he? God has a way of turning our endings, what we think are endings, into new beginnings. And that's what he's preparing his disciples for. Even though for 3 years he told them this was going to happen and this is coming, he has to give them those little reminders. Don't give up. There's a new beginning about to start. So don't give up. Let God turn your endings into a new beginning.